So let's bring back the conversation where we've been doing over the last couple of Tuesdays. And this hour, we talk about the public debt in this country. Civil society organizations coming together under the umbrella of the Okoa Uchumi Coalition are saying that we are facing an imminent debt crisis in this country. We've had conversations about this before, and we're still going to have this conversation today. How much the country has borrowed in terms of debt, rising from about 1.3 trillion shillings in 2013 to over 6 trillion shillings this year. We are seeing a situation where the country just keeps borrowing and borrowing. And how much are we repaying from our annual budget every year? We collect about 1.5 trillion shillings. Close to 1 trillion shillings goes into debt repayment. How much of this is, has been put into good use? Those are the questions that very many Kenyans have asked. In fact, when it comes to now issue of debt is a conversation that is had part of those jokes that are just part of Kenyan lingo. Deni, tuko na madeni, tuko na uhuru wa madeni, and all these other conversations. So issue of debt is a big conversation. Everybody now gets to a point where they understand it, but the depth of understanding of that debt issue is what we want to keep increasing. We're going to have a conversation now with Leonard Wanyama. He is a coordinator for the East Africa Tax and Governance Network, and this is a platform comprising civil society organizations with diverse interest on various tax or governance issues within the region. This is because there is a need for consistent understanding of public financial management issues within the EAC. So when we talk about tax, we talk about debt, we needed to bring the issue of taxation and the conversation and the link between those two, and how then they add up to our understanding. Tax in relation to debt. Are we taxed to pay debt? Are we paying tax to contribute to our own development? How much of our tax should be going towards paying debt? And at what point then do we get to a point where we say we're in a crisis like Zambia?
Tax. My goodness, tax is as old as sin. I don't think there's any period in the history of mankind when there have been no taxes. You may not have called it tax, but it has always been there. And unfortunately, those who have a direct relation with the collection of tax get a bad rap for this job that they do. But it's even worse when the money is collected and we even have an idea of how much is collected. And we're even told to what use this money is going to be put. And then when you observe, casually of course, not even in detail, you find that not what was said would be done has been done. And not once, not twice, it's something that happens. Every once in a while you get a pleasant surprise. And you actually find that the things that they said or were said by those in power that actually gets done. We wouldn't be having this discussion if things which were supposed to be done actually got done.
Sure.
No.
And I don't think you would have an issue with if a lot of this that you had that was being taxed, you could actually see the fruits of it in your daily life, that you wouldn't have to worry about so many things. If you could actually see the direct result of tax having been taken from you, it would make a difference. I mean, we have very many countries around the world as well as examples of such heavily taxed, but then you're not even complaining about government services. You don't have to look for them. They're there in your face, provided for. So then our expectations of what this tax then is doing, not met. And that's the unfortunate thing, I think, in a lot of cases that we are dealing with, that you can't see the result of this heavy tax burden that Kenyans have, even at the moment.
You sure you can't see?
Can you see?
Well, there's a lot that's happening as well. There's a lot of funding of government operations that comes directly from the tax that we remit to the government. Also, there is the issue of that we are currently able to service our debt. It's because we're able to raise that tax. If you get to a point where, like we were having the conversation about Zambia last week, and they get to a point where they are unable to raise enough revenues to fund their own operations and to repay debt, then we have a problem. Is that what we are at? Maybe, maybe not. Let's bring in the expert, Leonard Wanyama of the East Africa Tax and Governance Network. Good morning, Leonard.
Good morning, Eric. Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you. Welcome to the Situation Room.
Thank you.
You are a expert on governance issues. You're an expert on taxation. You're an expert as well on public finance management. Let's just get into getting that linkage. What is the link between taxation and public debt, and why should we be concerned about those two?
First, let me just start with the general problem that we try to address as tax and governance network, the East Africa Tax and Governance Network. So, generally, in any system, there would be some form of tax inequality. And by that, I would say manifestation of differences. So, who are you taxing? How are you taxing? How are you collecting that tax? That creates some differences among various communities or various individuals or entities within a country. Nonetheless, the challenge we are trying to solve is that we are increasingly finding ourselves in a system of tax injustice, where there seems to be some legal form of dodging taxes. And so our advocacy efforts try to address this issue, try to bring awareness in various forms, whether it's through research or just participation in various processes and so forth. This is because if you look at the Mbeki high-level report on illicit financial flows, they say that of the monies that leave Africa, 30% are in relation to corruption and theft and illegal activities, but 60% as a result of corporate avoidance in various forms. And so we try to address that by saying that we need to look at the loopholes, because as a revenue issue of taxation, once this money leaves, we cannot then finance a number of service delivery issues. And so that's the point in which we come in. And so essentially we then see that systems have a number of problems. For instance, increased tax burden on citizens, harmful tax practices, and overall distorted economic development. And those are the challenges we try to address by bringing a number of individuals, organizations, and the general public into these discussions.
All right. If you bring the general public, I belong to that general public. What you've just said sounds very interesting, but I don't understand half of it. And the reason I don't understand half of it is because when you talk about taxes, the first thing that occurs to me if I earn a salary is my income tax. If I have a car, there's this tax that I'm charged for fueling. How would you categorize tax so that it is understood by a common mwananchi like myself? What is it? What do we pay for to the government, in short?
Well, I would say that it is indeed a challenge to understand tax. We are looking at trying to simplify the language, because tax is a very niche discussion between lawyers and economists, and specifically accountants. So we try to look for ways in which we can generally simplify the conversation, make it more understandable. In the past 2 years, we've come around to the conclusion that we have to make tax a human rights issue, so that we can then make linkages to our daily problems. So for instance, as you're saying, City, that you want to know that this money has been taken away from you, and where does it go?
Yes.
By understanding the rights that are attached to that taxation, then we can make this conversation a bit more simpler. We can animate you and activate you to then participate better in terms of demanding your rights, demanding effective utilization of those taxations, and increasingly make you a more participating citizen in these processes.
Well, let's do that now, Leonard. Then what are some of these rights then that are yours? What are the rights? Because even before we started with this, we're looking at, okay, then what makes sense for a lot of Kenyans is not to understand that there was a hole, but it should be to understand what could be if you see what the proceeds from money that wasn't stolen, for example, could actually do. So what are the rights that you actually have as a Kenyan citizen when it comes to taxation that you should be able to see where that taxation goes? What are some of those rights that you're talking about?
Well, quite simply, in the Kenyan context, this is all contained in the Bill of Rights. Your right to food, your right to shelter, right to a decent education, right to healthcare. These are very clearly stipulated in the Constitution of Kenya and the Bill of Rights. And so the challenge is holding government and the responsible authorities to account. Because I think there is a difference and essentially an imagination that government will be open to you and just do the right thing. But if you don't understand the technical processes in which government then utilizes your money or makes the decisions around the taxation, then you are handicapped in that you can be provided for a tick box or a list of things that are being done, and you can't really challenge because, for instance, you don't know the process that went into first determining the expenses or prioritizing, fairly allocating, and then just properly spending that money. So the whole chain, based on collection to allocation and expenditure, has to have a degree of fairness. And therefore, if you are not familiar with what goes on through that process, then you are at a loss. You will get very easily confused by high-sounding words, and then you just wait for the next time probably a politician comes out for a handout. And that's what we want to change, to make people really interested in the whole process, from the taxation to the expenditure cycle.
Why aren't people involved in the process at the moment? Why do you think that is, Leonard? If we look at Kenyans and the landscape that we have at the moment, why are Kenyans not interested in the process?
Well, I think Kenyans, it's all a matter of priorities. You have to deal with your issues on a day-to-day. Holding leaders to account is very difficult. They maneuver you, they trick you, and when you corner them, then they retreat into procedures that you don't understand. And so it is like a vicious cycle. And the question is, how can we then develop a new civic education that will then kind of give them some inspiration to follow this up? I believe why we are thinking about this kind of idea of simplifying the language is to kind of try and replicate the civic education that happened during the constitution making process. Kenyans were equally very frustrated, but they got activated with new training, with new ideas, something to inspire them to look forward to holding their leaders to account. And so you see, for instance, that the consciousness that Kenyans have about haki yetu came through a lot of education in the 90s and early 2000s.
So what does it look like? I mean, if we can just take one aspect, if we look at what the rights are, especially when obviously here they were talking about taxation and such, and we said that, okay, there are rights that Kenyans have, right to food, shelter, clothing, education, etc. Just take one of those things and paint a picture of what it should look like. If you say that you're taxed for a certain thing, then what do we expect it to look like in the line of things in the country? You're taxed certain percentage for this. What should the end, if you're looking at it end to end, what should it look like? That you're taxed, this is what you should get as a result. If it doesn't happen, certain questions you should be asking, to who at what level, for you to get answers. If you could paint that picture, what would it look like?
So if we take the question of licenses, let's say you have a small business. The infrastructure around that small business definitely has to improve, right? Because that is what it's for. The water, for instance, if you have the hotel, has to be clean. The inspection has to take place regularly. all the way down to the fact that you don't need to be paying additional bribes and so forth. So if you've paid a license, first you also have to be considered that you are also inclusive in that. So you might be paying a license in one part of town, but it is servicing a totally different part of town, and you're excluded. And then, of course, it's not stolen. So, for instance, you have a shack in Eastlands, but the roads are being built in Kilimani, and yet you're the one who needs to be receiving produce every day in the morning. So those priorities have to kind of be aligned depending on why you have been taxed. But then, as I said earlier, it's very difficult to pin it down because all this money goes into one pot, and then there is the prioritization process, which is somewhat very opaque. So before you even get to understanding and getting people to actually remember that this shack is actually the one that provided the money, it just gets lost in a whole chain of things and events. But then again, you find that at the upper levels, then there is some problems of harmful tax practices. So, for instance, a mamamboga cannot evade taxes in one form or the other, or avoid taxes in one form or the other. But large companies have an avenue to avoid taxes and not pay them to the government because probably they're giving so much money, but then because of technical processes here and there, they can still whisk away a lot of money out of the country.
Just looking at the example that you've just given, let's say you're running a small business in some part of Eastlands, you're running a kinyozi, and therefore you've taken out a license with the Nairobi City County government. If we were to say then that the tax that you pay should also be used to improve services in your neighborhood, should we be saying that, for example, if the people who are running those small businesses, there's that kinyozi person, there's somebody else who's running a small restaurant, somebody else who's running mamamboga, who's running services, should they be having a conversation on how much they are contributing to the tax kitty and how much of that is then coming to improve their affairs? Or let's just look at an example. Go to Marikiti Market. Everybody who's operating at Marikiti is paying some tax in one way or the other. But then the services that they're getting at Marikiti are not commensurate with how much money or effort they are making in contributing to the tax kitty. How can they how can they get their issues addressed?
So, very simply, in the case of the people in Marikiti, that is clearly why you elect your officials and your elected leaders, because they would then contribute to some form of enlightened discussion about how such resources are reallocated back in a fair manner. And then if you're saying that, let's say, for example, that the CDF is the one that they have decided to use to improve the condition, then the expenditure is properly done. So that now you know that, look, of this CDF, this is going to be a proper amount that goes to improve the roads. Maybe add in some water now that you need water to just wash your hands in the event of COVID, and so forth. Mainly, this is a conversation that speaks between the citizen and the elected representative. But you find that the questions of tax treaties are on a much higher level. Because, first of all, they are executed mainly between the Ministry of, as it is right now, the Ministry of Finance and the Executive, and maybe the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, in just ensuring better relations with other countries. So the concern here is that, for instance, on the level of tax treaties, you're trying to signal a good business environment. But then, unfortunately, because of the nature of our tax treaties and the way they have been negotiated and signed, these companies then take advantage of poorly drafted documents to then whisk money out of the country. So there's that two level. There are those two levels. Now, linking those two is quite a challenge, and we are looking to explore through research about how we can then see and then champion the linkage between the two.
Sorry, City. I know you have a burning question. Just put it on ice for a bit. Speaking with Leonard Wanyama, who is the coordinator of the East African Tax and Governance Network, we are talking about the public debt in the country. Do we have a public debt crisis? Several civil society organizations and individuals have come together under the Okoa Uchumi Coalition, and they want to raise this as a national conversation. They're doing a very good job of that, raising this national conversation. Public debt situation in the country, saying that we have an imminent public debt crisis. Leonard Wanyama is a tax expert. He is a governance expert. He's a public finance management expert. Now we are looking at taxation versus debt and how those two link, and then how we know how to deal with them. CT, you had a burning question.
It wasn't really burning. It was just that I had a question and I hadn't looked at the time.
Smoldering.
Yes.
Sour breast.
Mr. Wanyama, what I've heard you say is heartening and even encouraging, but what I'd like to know is your success rate. Since you have been trying to put some of these principles into operation, what has been your rate of success?
Well, I will take the case of an issue called the double taxation agreement. Now, this is a situation in which the government has been signing treaties with a number of countries, 12 since the new constitution, in which we, for instance, kind of come to an agreement that Kenya will not, or Kenya and those countries will not be taxing an income twice for any company. So, for instance, if it is a British company coming into Kenya, we won't, between Kenya and the UK, the income that's generated won't be taxed twice. So, essentially, this was a very closed process, but with partnership and like with organizations like Tax Justice Network Africa, we used the means of public interest litigation, took the government to court, won the case against the government, and there has been somewhat of a change in behavior in regards to a treaty that was highlighted, that was the Kenya-Mauritius Treaty. Further, we've now taken the government, we've gone back to court with a new petition, highlighting 10 other treaties that were not properly done. Initially, the treaty was signed and there was no parliamentary involvement. But this year, Parliament actually called us to kind of give submissions about the Kenya-Mauritius Treaty. But also, at the ministerial level, we've seen them give us an open call to give technical submissions about the treaties, where could the problems be, so that we can kind of close the loopholes in regard to tax treaties and how they allow for the illicit transfer of funds out of the country. There's also, however, greater awareness on the subject. If you have been following the news, you might have seen the conversation about SportPesa and how about 6 trillion of its funds or income generated was just whisked away out of the country, based on what they'd say the treaty, the UK treaty provisions in relation to how you tax technical services provided from their resident country. And so that awareness is building, but also there's a shift in policy change. Now at least government is thinking of public participation, thinking about parliamentary involvement, because these were very close processes that were kind of covered within the ceremonial of diplomacy and treaty negotiations that were done between the ministry and other countries. So I think that shift, where there's that openness that is beginning to happen, is one of the things we can point to.
How is this openness manifested, Mr. Wanyama?
Sorry?
The openness that you say we are now witnessing, how is it manifested? If I were to look for it, what would I need to see in order to understand that the openness is taking place? Because if you talk about the matters going to Parliament, that is disheartening. It's not encouraging, okay? Because many things go to Parliament to die. They don't go to Parliament to see the light of day. If you talk about the ministry and what the ministry does, if I as a layman just look at what the management of our debt has been in this country, the basic tenets from what I have read are not really being met. So when we are seeing that, you're actually stating, and I'm paraphrasing what you're saying, is that progress is being made. How do we see this progress? What exactly is it?
So the conversation in Parliament is a start. We are hoping now the next stage will be an open conversation on the data that is availed about just taxation, about how much we collect, how much of our taxing rights are we giving away. That is the process. So this is the very early stages of this conversation. But we are now really hoping to have the data out in the open so that we know and we can determine whether these treaties are beneficial. And then now we can start linking this to, for instance, if you're giving away 6 trillion, how would that help the education sector? How would that help health, especially in these very tough times where we are trying to look for means to pay off debts, but also work our way as a country to become more self-sustainable, because we raise revenues in order to be able to be self-sustaining. And this was something that was previously part of the economic thinking for instance, under the Kibaki administration, but it seems our attraction to commercial loans kind of really took us down the wrong path. And so we still have to look for a way to bring ourselves back. And one of the ways, and one of the most sustainable ways, is to think properly about the revenues, how we are raising them, and what amounts, and how we can then channel them directly to 190.
So if I understand you right, Lawrence, what you're saying is it's possible that some of the treaties that we've entered into as a country are denying us the revenue that we should be generating in terms of taxation.
Very true, very true. Now, you find that it seems that the logic is that we are so keen to encourage a country that looks like a viable commercial entity that attracts countries to come in, set up businesses, probably employ some people, but then we are not thinking about how to make Kenya a more transformative economy. How does this play into raising revenue to the country directly? How does this help in terms of just encouraging homegrown companies? Because, for instance, if a company comes in that is doing exactly the same thing that a Kenyan is doing, you're already disadvantaging the Kenyan entity. So there is a mismatch in that whole dynamic of investment and chasing the ease of business statistics and indexes, as opposed to the productivity of the Kenyan, because this is not well thought out, and mainly it's a lot of pomp in chasing investment.
I'm sure you've worked on this.
Development.
As you're looking at all these treaties and all, I'm sure you've worked on it, and maybe you even have some indicative figures. How much could we be losing in terms of potential revenue that then ends up being shipped out of the country?
So I've just given a case in which one company shifted out $6 trillion dollars. So, but unfortunately, we are very vague in terms of the data. It's estimated like in Kenya probably about 3 trillion. But one of the reasons why we took the cases to court is to say, look, we can't continue having a conversation about estimates if at the very least our parliaments need to know how much are you giving away in terms of tax rights. And this is one of the fights we are really pushing, so that we don't want to talk about specifics, but the estimates based on exposés, like, for instance, when you read the Panama Papers, when you read the Mauritius leaks, is those kinds of figures. You find one entity moving a whole load of money. So that, for instance, the 6 trillion is something that's been recently in the news.
And why would the government do this? On one hand, you are really working hard at trying to find a way of expanding your tax net, or even taxing the already heavily taxed population. But on the other hand, you're giving away what we could just describe as low-hanging fruits to go to another country. Why would a government make such a decision?
Well, I would put this to the logic of what it would understand development to be. I'd spoken earlier about transformative economy. So, for instance, it seems there's a bit of lip service in relation to building local economies, building local value chains, but more commitment to what was the post-colonial or colonial extractive form of economy. So, for instance, a significant belief that it is only foreign investors who can come and improve our situation, as opposed to encouraging local entities and linking local value chains. So, for instance, it's been years before you find that you can link the maize-producing areas of this country to the drought-stricken areas. So, for instance, the pastoralists and the farmers are not really linked per se. So, if those two could be linked, you'd find there'd be a new kind of economy emerging out of that. So that as the cattle are coming down providing meat, for instance, the farmers will be providing maize to those areas. So if you link those two, then you're building the new transformative economy, as opposed to this kind of economy where we believe that once you just look for quick imports into the country. And this is also very tied to a lot of vested interests that play out in various policy spaces.
So in other words, what I hear you say, so we have opportunity to raise more revenue. We are not raising that more revenue because of the kind of treaties that we've entered into. But at the same time, we are still borrowing heavily so that we can finance our operations, our development, and even to some extent, our recurring expenditure. So where do we strike the balance then? How do we correct this situation?
So, the first thing we definitely have is to work through and improve the political process, holding politicians to account, holding policymakers to account, and kind of improving the parliamentary and policy engagement that is needed in that area, so that needs are properly assessed, are known, and allocations are made to that effect. It seems right now there's somewhat of a big gulf, some form of estrangement between the needs of the people and the people making decisions to them, and that is very key. In as much as we'll be doing tax education and so forth, there's also a great deal of political education that needs to be helping people in trying to help them understand what kind of political decisions they need to make going forward. And especially now that we are now going into an electoral season. One of the biggest problems is that our debt is coming about because of overambitious political promises. And so we have to kind of get people educated to see that this conversation happens, so that we don't get into these cycles where, for instance, you're promised a huge hospital, as you had mentioned earlier, but you have no staff that goes into that planning. So then you have this structure where, unfortunately, you might call it a hospital, but all you have are cows grazing in that compound. So that has to be a clear process that improves that political and policy engagement.
Leonard, who would be responsible for these processes? I mean, when we talk about the things that you're talking about, simplifying the language, offering political education to kind of counter these overambitious processes that have been put in play, who is responsible? Because surely we can't depend on those who are the guardians of these political processes, for example, to come and teach the people something otherwise. So who's responsible for getting this done? Who should take up the mantle?
At this point in time, of course, civil society, religious organizations, professional bodies. And if you look at particularly professional bodies, they have a vested interest in this. They are the ones feeling the pinch of all the taxes that are coming about, and they should be at the forefront. This is mainly a stakeholder process that will then force the people who are in seats of governance to take notice of what is happening to the people out there. Resident associations, circles, and so forth. So it's mainly in those groupings that the new logic in terms of understanding how tax and tax burdens are affecting the people can then be put forward to the policymakers.
You've actually outlined fairly clearly how it is you chart out the path that you want to follow. But what I want to ask is, what path do you chart out to listening to the views of the ordinary citizen with a view to what they understand these wonderful things that you're putting forth will impact on their lives and the realities of what already exists and the impact this has on their lives?
So we've obviously first started to we've done the research and just thinking about revenue obligation and the civics around public finance management. But now we definitely have to go out there and pick views and then see how we channel these views upwards. Of course, now the realities and the day-to-day goings-on of the average Kenyan are some of the things that we'll have to deal with. So it's a process. I think it's also a matter of getting people interested. In Kenya today, you might have picked up there is a growing movement of social justice centers. These are groups that, for instance, when we are on the research side and the training side, they keep telling us, come to us. We need you to come and teach us so that we can hold people to account. We have identified, for instance, our MCA. This is the project that is going on, but we need to be equipped enough to then go into those processes. So, for instance, they are handed documents for public participation, but they have no understanding. The demand is already there, and we are looking into how we can plug into those conversations and equip people a bit better as days proceed.
As I'm sure you'd understand, Leonard, when it comes to issues of taxation, the issues of debt, the issues of public finance management, these are fairly complex issues to every ordinary Kenyan. How would you break down that conversation if you just to take this opportunity and show us the link between how much we are taxed on a daily basis, how much we are paying in terms of public debt, and how much is not financing our day-to-day lives? How would you put that in a statement or just in a paragraph?
It's always very difficult to do that. But to explain to someone, I would ask them about, let's talk of, for instance, the loaf of bread or the milk.
Okay.
When it increases in price based on VAT,
Yep.
what benefit do they see? Did the healthcare they were promised magically appear? No. The education? No. The roads? No. On those grounds alone, they should be knocking on a leader's door, asking them what is happening. Because the simple fact that you've been taxed and the reasons that you are taxed have not materialized means there's a problem and you should immediately start asking. On that alone.
So how soon then that person would ask you, all right, so the price of bread and milk has gone up today. How soon should I start seeing a noticeable difference in my life?
I would say we would encourage them to look at things on a yearly basis, based on the cycle of the budget. If you take, for instance, the tax relief that came about with the COVID-19, what has changed? So, for instance, what's in your pocket at this point in time? Because that was a very simple change. If things are still not okay, then that means that you need to start knocking on leaders' door, you need to start knocking on parliamentarians' door, because it means that there is a problem already. The simple relief that was given is still not helping. On a wider scale, I think at this point in time, every Kenyan should be concerned, very concerned, from what we are hearing about our health sector. We are all in this process where we hear that you can't get hospital admission. we should all be up in arms about this conversation about NHIF at this point in time. What is going wrong? Those are just the very basics. Those are your rights. And that would be the very simple way to look at it. This is supposed to happen. It is
and
not.
it's not happening. So what is the connection
It's not
between
happening.
that and the public debt, the 6 trillion shillings that we have borrowed and we are repaying on a yearly basis? What's the connection between me not being able to pay for hospitalization because of COVID and the debt?
So the question would be, why are we getting this debt? And for them, it's just to ask that simple question. Why do we take up debt? The reality of the situation is that most of the debt goes into paying other debts and paying salaries, the current expenditure across the board. But in terms of improving the lives of Kenyans, it's not happening. And so Kenyans would then have to mobilize themselves in terms of how they're asking these questions to ask deeply, why necessarily do we have to keep taking loans again and again if it's not helping healthcare, it's not helping education? If you're not investing in the people, then why are we taking up debt? And then channel the conversation forward.
I see that, and I can see that in my head. But at the same time, I also realize that Kenyans are also still quite burdened with the day-to-day activities that they have to go through for survival. So whereas on the one hand, Kenyans understand that things are not going according to how they should actually be running and that something should be done. But unless there is a lead, unless there is an umbrella under which Kenyans can then just follow, it will be then very difficult for them to leave the responsibilities that they have, which in some cases are a burden on a daily basis for them, to come and now start agitating for some kind of change. Which is why I'm thinking that it would be absolutely necessary for there to be somebody who would champion this, lead this, and then call others to the flock per se, to then go about in this agitation, because I don't see like the mushrooming of Kenyans one on their own to now start agitating for this kind of change, unless it comes under the leadership of one, unless it comes under the leadership of a group who has maybe a platform. I don't know how that would be when Kenyans are grappling with so many other things at the same time. So how would you see this playing out, Leonard?
And I think this is what Okoa Ochumi is trying to do, realizing the complexity of the problem, realizing the burdens that people are going through. We are looking for a new way to champion some political accountability on these issues. We have organizations that are a core group that focus on public finance management, but we'll then see how it links into governance issues. It will then see how to link with various stakeholders and their issues. I think it's an opportune time. First, if you realize the Kenyan budget cycle for next year has already started. So the processes and the avenues for those conversations, we'll see how to move into that and see how best we can bring Kenyans along on those conversations as we move into the next year and looking into that. So this is, as Okoa Ochumi and the coalition of like-minded organizations, we hope that we can be that organization that brings this together and champion the voices of the people and their actions in the coming year as we go ahead.
Leonard, we want to thank you very much for joining us today. Leonard Wanyama is the coordinator, the East Africa Tax and Governance Network. They have also come together with the other civil society organizations under the Okoa Ochumi coalition umbrella, pushing the agenda and the conversation on public debt and public debt management. Leonard, we wish you a good day, and asante sana for speaking to us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Right.
The only way to start your day.